Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 118, Stonework and Treason. Before we dive into the episode, a quick shout out to thank Bodil for supporting us on Ko-fi.com. For more information on how you can also help support the show, we'll have information at the end of the episode, or go check out our podcast page at sengokudaimyo.com. And now, on with the episode. Sogonoa Kaie's mansion was busily quiet. There was plenty of chatter, but it was mostly in hushed tones as servants busied themselves with their work, but wondered just what was going on. They couldn't help but notice the high-ranking visitors that had come. It was to be expected, though. After all, their master was in charge while the rest of the court was away on a retreat, comforting the sovereign in her grief. And so why wouldn't people be showing up to meet with him? But nobody was quite sure what all these visitors were discussing. They had all gone into an upper story of the building, but the crowd included some powerful figures, including, some said, a royal prince. Who's who and where people stood in the court were always topics of discussion, but especially now. After all, what they were dealing with was unprecedented. Who had heard of a sovereign stepping down in the first place, let alone stepping back up because they outlived their successor? But she was no spring chicken either. Surely it would be her son that would finally ascend the throne next, right? But that was never guaranteed. Either way, some of the servants grumbled a change would be nice. Ever since the royal family had moved back to Asuka, formally making it the capital again, there had been a flurry of activity. Sure, it meant that a certain amount of prestige returned to that region, and houses that had been in disrepair were suddenly occupied again, but there was so much more. Just about all of the available labor pool that wasn't working the fields was working on this project or that. There was almost nothing left for anyone else. How was anyone supposed to get things done when all of the able-bodied people were already toiling on the sovereign's own vanity projects? And right after building that giant government complex in Naniwa, no less. Such was, I imagine, the hushed rumor-mongering going on in the house, when suddenly there came a loud crack, as of a piece of wood snapping in two. Later they would learn that an old wooden rest had broken, but that wasn't immediately obvious. The servants did notice that shortly thereafter their visitors began to depart, heading back to their own mansions. As for Sogonoa Kaie, he said nothing, but he seemed drained. He had a heavy look as though he was bearing an incredible weight. Soon thereafter he requested a brush and some paper, and he began to write out a letter. Alright, so we are talking about the second reign of Takara Hime, who came back to the throne in 655 following the death of her brother, Prince Karu, known as Kotoku Tenno. For the first time she reigned, the chroniclers gave her the name Kogyoku Tenno, but her second reign she would be known in the chronicles as Saimei Tenno. We already discussed some of what was recorded as happening in the north during Takara Hime's second reign, with the Emishi and the Mishihase, and the expeditions by Abe no Omi no Hirafu. This episode, we are going to focus more on what was going on in the home provinces of Yamato, and most specifically the impact that Takara Hime's reign would have on Asuka. I've noted in the past how modern Asuka can seem like your typical rural Japanese town. Roads weave between beautiful rice fields flanked by densely packed neighborhoods at the foot of the green hills or lining the shores of the Asuka River. To the north, the valley opens into the vast Nara Basin, a largely flat region that is much more heavily populated but still would be considered inaka or rural country by anyone from a metropolis like Tokyo or Osaka. To the south, the land rises up into the mountain peaks. Beyond that ridge, the land drops into the Yoshino River Valley, but otherwise the rest of the Kii Peninsula to the south is covered in a sparsely populated mountain range where small villages carve out a life in the nooks and crannies between the numerous ridges, finding the rare spot of flat land to build houses and plant their fields. Looking at it today, Asuka might seem idyllic, rural, and calm. And yet, back in Takara Hime's day, it was anything but. When Takara Hime moved back to Asuka, she went on a building spree. In fact, the Chronicles actually complain about all of the building she was doing, and, well, we'll get to that. Much of this episode is going to revolve around her building projects, as well as her comings and goings. While we'll talk about what the Chronicles say, I also want to talk about some of what still remains in Asuka today. Certainly, the grand palaces are gone for the most part, leaving little more than postholes lying beneath the rice fields. A bit more obvious are the kofun, scattered across the landscape. But beyond that, there were also stone works, including numerous carved stones, ranging from crude statues, which may have been just minimally worked, to elaborate fountains, which would have used natural water pressure to create impressive waterworks. These latter works demonstrate the sophistication of the masons of the time and hint at the grandeur of the various palaces, gardens, and mansion complexes that once populated the landscape. And if you want a little feeling of what it's like, I talked a little bit about walking through Asuka in a bonus episode back in March of 2024. If you're interested, look up Traveling Through the Ancient Nara Basin, Part 2. So along with what we see in the Chronicles, I want to talk about some of these other features, even if we aren't entirely sure of when exactly they were built. There are a few, though, that we do suspect were built in this period by Takara Hime, or at least at her order. So we'll talk about those as we get there. Now, her reign wasn't all about building things. Politics in the Yamato court remained as cutthroat as ever. Although Prince Nakano Oe, Takara Hime's son, had been designated as crown prince, he had not taken the throne, despite being of age, and we aren't told why, though the fact that Takara Hime had previously abdicated because of the events of the Ishii incident back in 645, well, that may have meant that she was still considered the senior eligible member of the royal line. Then there was the case of Prince Arima. Prince Arima was the son of Karu, aka Kotoku Tenno, which made him Nakano Oe's cousin. This wouldn't have meant anything had his father not ascended the throne, and under the succession practices of the time, although Nakano Oe was designated as the crown prince, that wasn't a guarantee that he would be next in line, so Prince Arima may have been a potential candidate. However, there's at least one source that says Prince Arima was not yet of age, he was still a teenager. Still, that was no doubt old enough for some of the court to support him, and as we'll see in later centuries, age limits could be negotiable. So we'll also discuss that as well. Alright then, let's get into it. When the royal family first moved back to Asuka in 653, they took up residence in the temporary palace of Kawabe no Miya. Unfortunately, this name doesn't tell us much about where the palace was located. There is one theory that Kawabe no Miya might be what is known as the Asuka Inabuchi Palace site up in the Asuka River Valley in the modern Iwaido district, a little south of the famous Ishibutai Kofun site. This is believed to have been a palace, or at least the mansion of some very wealthy family, given its layout, including what appears to be a cobblestone courtyard and the lack of any roof tiles, which would have been reserved for temples at the time. Now, the term temporary palace comes up a lot in the Chronicles. In most cases where it is used, it suggests that there was already a building in place and the sovereign took up residence there, hence the term temporary palace. Oftentimes we see that a temporary palace is said to have been built, at which point I have to wonder if that is truly the case. I mean, did they actually build a brand new structure to temporarily house the sovereign and the royal family? Or does it just refer to the fact that they may have taken an existing compound and perhaps made some slight changes to accommodate the royal dignity? Unfortunately, the Chronicles don't really go into much detail about how they built or prepared these palaces. They just take it for granted that you'll know. Now, wherever the Kawabe no Miya happened to be, it does seem to have been temporary, as we later see Takara Hime back at the Itabuki Palace, and indeed she reascended the throne there in 655. The Itabuki Palace first shows up in Takara Hime's first reign, and seems to be one of at least two royal palaces in Asuka at the time, the other one being the Oharida Palace. The Oharida Palace had been around for a while. It was noted as early as 603 in the reign of Kashikiya Hime, aka Suiko Tenno, and there is the suggestion that it was still around in the time that Karu, aka Kotoku Tenno, was reigning. We know that Takara Hime took up residence there at some point during her own reign as well. But in 643 she had the Itabuki Palace built, though apparently that didn't mean that the Oharida Palace was completely torn down and abandoned. It was just no longer the primary site of court ritual, I guess. Of course, the Itabuki Palace wouldn't be the seat of the government for long either, as the Ishii incident took place there in 645, and Karu would subsequently move the capital to Naniwa, building the Toyosaki Palace. And so the Itabuki Palace remained, but was not exactly kept up, I suspect, so that when the royal family returned to Asuka, well, apparently it wasn't ready for them to inhabit, and likely required extensive renovation. Nonetheless, it was being inhabited 2 years later when Takara Hime again ascended the throne. Quick note here about the name Itabuki, because we think that this likely referred to a very specific style of construction that was used. Now, up to this point, as far as we can tell, the primary roofing material for all major buildings was a kind of local thatching. We see this today on some shrines and other buildings. Itabuki, in contrast, appears to refer to a roof made with wooden boards. Today, we have buildings with roofs where the roof shingles are overlapping boards of wood or bark from the cypress tree, thin layers stacked one on top of the other. Even today, the modern imperial palace in Kyoto uses wood shingles rather than the curved roof tiles that many people think of when they think of Asian architecture. So that's the Itabuki Palace, all spruced up and ready for Takara Hime to occupy again. That said, remember the older Oharida Palace, the other one in Asuka? Well, later in 655, a project was started to update that palace as well. We're told that as of the 13th day of the 10th month, there had been a plan to add roof tiles to one of the buildings at the Oharida Palace, but unfortunately, much of the timber from the mountains and valleys that was designated for the project was found to be too weak from rot, and so they decided to not go forward with that plan. I would note here that tiled roofs, while they might appear to be somewhat easier to put together, after all, you only need a layer of interlocking and overlapping tiles, are extremely heavy. They are known to deform the wooden structures underneath them and can weigh hundreds of pounds per square foot. Much of the classic shape of these tiled roofs developed over time to compensate for some of that weight, so this makes me wonder if the wood that the palace craftspeople brought was really that rotten, or if it was just not strong enough for the work that they were trying to do. After all, were they applying the same techniques as for a temple, or were they simply trying to replace traditional thatching or shingles with clay tiles? Either way, the project failed, even after all of the work that had gone into it. This is a small entry in the Chronicles, but it would have meant levying corvée labor that had to go out to the designated regions to source the timber, not to mention setting up the kilns to make the tiles, as well as other preparations that would have been necessary. In other words, a lot of work for apparently no payoff. On top of that, we are told that around that time, in the winter of that year, that would have been around the 10th, 11th, or 12th lunar month, roughly corresponding to late November to February of the following year in the modern calendar. Well, during that time, the Itabuki Palace caught fire and burned down, and so the sovereign and her retinue decamped to the temporary palace of Kawara, the river plain or field. Kawara could theoretically refer to just about any flat area by a river. Aston points out that Kawara can also mean roof tile, which is interesting given that the entry immediately before that deals with attempting to add new roof tiles to a part of the Oharida Palace. However, there is some thought that this refers to Kawara Temple, Kawara-dera, and you can find claims that Kawara-dera was built on the site of the temporary palace. There is a reference to Kawara-dera in the previous reign in the year 653, though another source apparently says it was talking about Yamada-dera. There isn't another mention of Kawara-dera that I can find until 673, so it's entirely possible that the temple started off its life as a mansion or even a temporary royal palace of some kind, and that it was later turned into a temple. Now, Kawara-dera itself is rather interesting. If you visit the site today, you can see large stone bases that help to demonstrate the size of the ancient temple. It was one of the 4 great temples of Asuka, along with Asuka-dera, Kudara-o-dera, and Yakushiji. And yet, unlike those other 3, we don't have clear indications about its founding in the Chronicles. When the capital eventually moved to Heijō-kyo in Nara City, many of the other temples were removed to the new capital, but not, as far as I can see, Kawara-dera. Donald McCallum suggests that this is because it was replaced instead by Kofukuji, a temple with deep ties to the descendants of Nakatomi no Kamatari, aka the Fujiwara clan. He suggests that mention of the temple in the official records may have even been suppressed by individuals such as Fujiwara no Fubito. Kawada-dera remained in Asuka, and eventually it fell to ruin, but there is a small temple on the site known as Gufukuji. As for the Kawada Palace, well, if Kawada-dera really was in operation by 653, it is possible that the sovereign took over some of the buildings at Kawada-dera, or perhaps the temporary palace was simply somewhere nearby. In any case, they don't seem to have stayed there for too long. They started work on a new palace immediately come the following year. This was the later Okamoto Palace, and from what we can tell, it was built on the same site as the Itabuki Palace south of Asuka-dera. We actually have various archaeological evidence from this site, and we can see the multiple palaces over the years. Even today, you can go and see some of the postholes that they found, indicating the size of the complex as it evolved. Now, based on the layout and size of the Asuka palaces, it seems that these early palaces focused on the dairi, the private quarters of the sovereign. This seems to have ignored the reforms made with the Toyosaki Palace, designed in Naniwa in the early 650s. That palace, which was built on an incredibly grand scale, consisted of both the private quarters and the public government offices. But in Asuka, the royal family's palace appears to have only consisted of the private quarters, or at least for the most part. So where was the actual bureaucracy happening? Were there other facilities we don't know about? Or perhaps the Toyosaki Palace itself was overly ambitious and there wasn't actually the staff for such a grand complex. After all, they were just setting up the bureaucracy and perhaps their reach had exceeded their grasp. Or was it the case that there were still things being run out of the palace complex in Naniwa while the sovereign lived in Asuka? That seems to have been roughly 10 hours away by foot, though perhaps only half that by horse. Not an entirely inconceivable distance. Now, this area of the Asuka Valley is not as well suited to a large palace complex either. Not only was it already full of temples and the like, but the ground itself rises to the south, and the hills on either side start to come together. It certainly isn't the kind of place to lay out a grand city, but perhaps that was not the intent, at least not immediately. Didn't matter much though, because the later Okamoto Palace, as it came to be known, was not long for this world. Scarcely had it been built and occupied, but it caught fire and burned down. Another expenditure of funds and labor that were once more counted as nothing. In fact, Takara Hime was apparently on a tear and went ahead and initiated quite a few projects that happened in 656. We're told that nearby Tamu Peak was crowned with a circular enclosure close to where two tsuki trees grew. A lofty building was erected and called both Futatsuki no Miya, the Palace of the Two Tsuki, and Amatsumiya, the Palace of Heaven. She also had a new palace erected in Yoshino, possibly as a seasonal retreat. And with this, she was just getting started. She also had laborers dig a canal all the way from the western end of Mount Kaguyama to Mount Isonokami. We are told that 200 barges were then loaded with stone from Mount Isonokami and hauled to the mountain east of the palace, where the stones were piled up to form a wall. The last one had people up in arms. They called the canal the Mad Canal and said that it wasted the labor of over 30,000 people. On top of that, she used 70,000 men to build the wall. And to top it all off, the timber for the palace rotted away and the top of the mountain where they were building collapsed. We're told that people actually cursed it all, crying out, "May the mound built at Isonokami break down of itself as fast as it is built." So yeah, people weren't too happy. We, however, just might be, because all of this building work, it leaves traces in the landscape. We aren't always sure about locations in the Chronicles, as it is very easy for names to shift over time, or for things to be renamed at a later date. But what we do know is that there are quite a few examples of stonework in the Asuka region. There's, for example, the Kamiishi stone that looks only vaguely carved. It appears to have two carved eyes, but otherwise appears to use the natural shape of the stone to evoke a tortoise. Possibly that's from erosion, or possibly they just used the natural stone. And that sits near the site of Kawaradera and Tachibana-dera. There are also the various saruishi, carved figures that are purportedly based on saru or monkeys, but are likely meant to represent people. They may have once adorned an elite family's garden or similar, but they were since moved to the tomb of Kibitsu Hime. There are various fountains and waterworks, and then there are the Sakafune Ishi ruins, sitting along a ridge east of the palace site. This consists of a large stone up on the hill with carved channels that appear to be made to channel water that were poured into those grooves. At the bottom of the hill, there's a turtle-shaped stone basin filled from a boat-shaped water tank. Across the hill is an example of stonework, including possible walls. Now, given the apparent age of everything and its location, it's thought that this may all be part of the Futatsuki no Miya complex that Takara Hime built. Unfortunately, it is still not clear how it was meant to operate. After Asuka was abandoned as the capital, knowledge of the site also seems to have disappeared. There were some stories that arose about the stone, that it was used for some kind of sake brewing, hence the name Sakafune Ishi, but nothing truly concrete has ever arisen. There may have been other structures, perhaps made of wood, that are no longer present, and the stone itself appears to have broken and eroded away over the years. It may have been meant as a ritual site, or perhaps just built as some kind of wonder for the people. It doesn't fit into any clear model of any Buddhist or even ancient Shinto practice that I can tell, nor is it clearly connected to other continental practices. We certainly know that they did plenty with water, given the number of waterworks and other carved stones, including a model of Mount Sumera, which we're told was built to the west of Asuka-dera on the 15th day of the 7th month of the following year, that is 657. So maybe these are remnants of that project. Whatever its purpose, the Sakafune Ishi site does seem to compare favorably with what is described in the Nihon Shoki, and perhaps it was considered such a waste of resources just because it didn't fit in with the prevailing ritual culture. Maybe Takara Hime was too artistically avant-garde for her time. Now, wasting resources would in fact become a chief complaint against Takara Hime during her time on the throne, and that takes us from seemingly harmless construction projects into the court politics of the day. Now, as you should recall, Prince Nakano-Oe, Takara Hime's son, was the crown prince at this point, and quite influential. He was supported by various courtiers, such as Nakatomi no Kamatari, the Nai Daijin, but his eventual ascendancy to the throne was not entirely assured. We've seen plenty of examples where someone would seem to be in line for the throne, and they didn't ever make it. We know that there were several other royal princes at this time. One of the youngest was Prince Takeru, a grandson of Takara Hime, who was born around 651. Then there was Prince Nakano-Oe's brother, Prince Owama. He was also one of Takara Hime's sons, and while we haven't heard much of him in the narrative, we will definitely see more of him in the future. On top of the two of them, there is Prince Arima, whom I talked about at the beginning of the episode. Prince Arima was mentioned as the son of Karu and Otarashi Hime, but his mother was not Karu's queen. That was Hashibito, a daughter of Okinaga Tarashi Hironuka, aka Jomei Tenno, and also daughter of Takara Hime herself. Yep, Karu basically married his own niece, though that may have been an attempt to keep the most direct connection possible to the royal line. Arima's mom, Otarashi Hime, on the other hand, was the daughter of Abe no Kurashi no Omi, the minister of the left or Sadaijin during Karu's reign. Strictly speaking, based on the way that the succession has been depicted so far, Prince Arima wouldn't technically meet the requirements. That said, we've certainly seen where that has been bypassed in previous reigns, and no doubt people were aware just how easily it could be to rewrite the history if they had to. He was young, but not so young that he couldn't be involved in the politics of the court. Now, other than a note about his parentage at the start of Karu's reign, Prince Arima isn't mentioned again until the 9th month of 657, and right off the bat you can tell where the chroniclers fell on his personality. They describe him as deceitful, and claim that he pretended to be insane, a term that really doesn't show up elsewhere in the Nihon Shoki, so it's hard to know exactly what's meant by this. I mean, is he the Hamlet of his age? Arima used this as an excuse to go to Muro Onsen, thought to be modern Shirahama hot springs on the southwestern end of the Kii Peninsula. When he came back, he sang its praises, claiming that scarce had I seen that region when my complaint disappeared of itself. The queen, Takara Hime, was intrigued and wanted to go and see it for herself. Now, overall, this hardly seems to be very deceitful, though it is suspected that Arima may have feigned an illness to avoid some of the politics around the start of the new reign. Given his father Karu's recent death, it would likely have been easy enough to claim that he was greatly depressed. We aren't told how long he stayed at Muro Onsen, but presumably it was for some time. At the start of the following year, on the 13th day of the first month, Kosei no Tokuda no Omi, the current Sadaijin, or Minister of the Left, passed away. This would have no doubt created some ripples, but little more is said. We don't even know the name of who succeeded him in the position, at least not in the Nihon Shoki. 4 months later, which is to say the 5th month of that same year, 658, Prince Takeru passed away. He was only 8 years old, but as the grandson of Takara Hime, a temporary tomb was constructed in the Imaki Valley. Takara Hime lamented his death greatly, and in the 10th month she took Arima's advice and went to visit the Kii Onsen. She had several poems composed and handed them to Hata no Okura no Miyatsuko no Mari to record them for posterity. Now, while she was away, Sogono Akae no Omi was the acting official in charge, and several weeks in, he addressed Prince Arima. He noted that there were 3 problems with Takara Hime's government. A rather bold statement, if I do say so myself. Now, first, she builds treasuries on a grand scale, collecting the riches of the people. Second, she wastes the public grain revenue in digging long canals. Third, she loads barges with stones and transports them to be piled into a hill. This may have been popular opinion, but it was also rather treasonous talk. Prince Arima simply smiled and said, "I have only now come to an age where I am fit to bear arms." So, yeah, he was basically saying that he was old enough to take up arms, and presumably lead others in a rebellion if that was the case. 2 days later, on the 5th day of the 11th month, Prince Arima met Akae at his mansion. They went into one of the upper stories where they wouldn't be interrupted, and there they conspired together. Others also seem to have been involved. Mori no Kimi no Oishi, Sakaibe no Muraji no Kusuri, and Shihoya no Muraji no Konoshiro. Whether they were at this meeting or simply in the know, it's unclear. There are a few different books that claim to record what the plans were. One says that Sogono Akae, Shihoya no Konoshiro, Mori no Oishi, and Sakaibe no Kusuri divined the future of their conspiracy by drawing slips of paper to see how it would turn out. Another book states that Arima claimed he would burn down the palace and take 500 men to march down south. There he would waylay Takara Hime at the harbor of Muro, and they were going to exile her to Awaji Island, setting up a fleet of ships to ensure that she could never leave. As they were discussing what to do, no doubt talking about how the prince could take the throne, a leg rest that they were using broke. Another book claims it was an armrest instead, but otherwise the details are the same. They both agreed that was a bad omen and decided not to proceed any further with their plans. Prince Arima returned home, but apparently Sogono Akae had a change of heart. He seems to have figured that his only way out was to turn in the others and admit everything. And so that night, Akae sent Mononobe no Enoi no Muraji no Shibi, who was in charge of the laborers working on the palace, and they surrounded the palace, and then Akae sent a mounted courier to inform Takara Hime. That letter must have laid everything out. Takara Hime had the conspirators arrested and brought to Kii Onsen. Arima's servant, Niitabe no Muraji no Yonemaru, followed them. Prince Nakano-Oe himself questioned Arima about why he plotted treason, and Arima's answer is a bit cryptic. "Heaven and Akae know," he responded. "I do not understand at all." In the end, all of the conspirators were found guilty and executed. Taji no Osawa no Muraji no Kuniso was sent to do the task. Prince Arima was strangled at the Fujishiro acclivity, along with Shihoya no Konoshiro and Niitabe no Yonemaru. Before being executed, Konoshiro made a rather macabre request, asking that, presumably after he was dead, they cut off his right hand and make it a national treasure. The other two conspirators, Mori no Oishi and Sakaibe no Kusuri, were merely banished, presumably having played less of a role. Once again, we must remember that we are only getting one side of the story. It is definitely convenient for Nakano Oe to have a potential rival out of the way. At the same time, it is certainly plausible that there was more than a little bit of consternation about how Takara Hime had been spending so much on all these construction projects. And yet, were these Takara Hime's projects all alone? Remember, Prince Nakano Oe seems to have had a fair bit of clout. After all, he orchestrated the original coup where he killed Sogono Iruka and his father, and then he declined the throne but became a major part of the new government. He was apparently powerful enough that he organized the move back to Asuka against the wishes of Karuno Okimi. So would all of these projects have been done without his involvement? This is an area where I have to admit that I probably need to check my bias. On the one hand, it is rare enough in patriarchal accounts to see women with agency and in positions of power, and so it's easy enough to make an assumption that any agency they are given in the record, they likely had more than is mentioned. At the same time, in this particular instance at least, Takara Hime's role in this could just as easily be a cover to preserve the image of Nakano Oe, who is certainly portrayed as a hero figure, bringing much needed change and modernization, such as it was, to Yamato. His enemies are always shown to be in the wrong, and even if he is accused of something horrible, such as the death of Sogono Ishikawa no Maro, it turns out that, well, it was actually the fault of someone else, such as the person who slandered Maro to him in the first place. So could it be that these unpopular construction projects were actually his doing all along? Was the conspiracy simply to overthrow Takara Hime, or was it focused on both her and Nakano Oe together? Now, to be honest, I couldn't say for certain. All we have to go on is what the chroniclers tell us, and they lay the blame fairly firmly at the feet of Takara Hime. But do remember that Nakano Oe is not necessarily the shining prince that he is often made out to be, and that people rarely come to or stay in power in a society like Yamato's by being nice all the time. We certainly know what he is capable of from the Ishii incident, and we shouldn't forget that in the narrative. Now, Takara Hime eventually returned from Kiyonsen after winter ended in the new year. We're told she got back on the third day of the first month of 659. A couple of months later, on the first day of the third month, she went to Yoshino and held a banquet there, no doubt at the palace she had constructed. Now, this may have been at the site of the Miyataki ruins, where excavations have revealed numerous examples of roof tiles and other artifacts that may have come from a building from the Asuka or Nara era. Now, the visit to Yoshino must have been quick, as we're told that 2 days later she visited Hiraura in Aomi, on the shores of Lake Biwa. Perhaps this only means she left 2 days later, since that must have been quite the journey back in the day. Would she have traveled on horseback, or in a carriage, or something similar? No doubt a full procession would take time, and I doubt that the sovereign would push herself. We also don't have a reason for her to go that I can see, other than just to go visit. It's an odd entry, to say the least. Now, I think it might be best to end it there. I do encourage anyone who can to get down to Asuka and plan to spend a couple of days if you really want to get around. You may want to rent a bike or even a car to get everything, though you can walk to most of the various sites. There are several museums and cultural centers set up to expound upon Asuka culture, with a focus on the history and archaeology specifically of that period. The palace site where Takara Hime ruled would continue to be the location of at least 2 more palaces, which we'll talk about in time. Before that, though, we'll want to cover a few more things. Most importantly, we'll want to talk about the relationship with the lands outside of the archipelago. We'll discuss the man from Takara, who may have simply been from the Ryukyu Islands, or possibly from as far away as the Dvaravati Kingdom in modern-day Thailand, or even from the western edge of India and Pakistan, having traveled the Silk Road. Some have even suggested that he may be a Tokharian, and we'll talk about what that means. Then, before we finish, we'll have to talk about everything else going on, including the conclusion of the Tang-Baekje War. But until then, I want to thank you all for listening and for all of your support. Remember, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or you can find links over to our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we'll have some more discussion and photos on topics from this episode. Also, please feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.